This morning, I am in Palm Springs, California, visiting with Marcia J Koslov, who since December 2012 has been the retired executive director of the Los Angeles County Law Library. Marcia, it is our custom in these sessions to ask the individual with whom I'm speaking to tell us a little bit about themselves as human beings, in addition to being law librarians. Could you tell us a little bit about your life, perhaps not only today, but even when you were younger?
Well, I grew up in University City, St. Louis, Missouri,
Okay.
and have 3 sibs, and we're a very close family. And my older sister is a violinist in St. Louis with the St. Louis Philharmonic, and taught music and still is president of the St. Louis Philharmonic and has a quartet, and she's played with everybody from Pavarotti to Led Zeppelin. It's amazing.
Sounds like she's had an interesting career.
She's-
You probably get to go listen to it once in a while, and it's a nice treat.
It is, and she's terrific. And my dad was a violinist, and so he taught each of us have an instrument. So my older sister Marilyn is a violinist. I play the piano. My brother is next. Steve is a doctor in Madison, Wisconsin. He's a pediatrician, and he played sax and clarinet. And then my younger sister is in Denver. She's a rabbi, and she plays cello and guitar. So we lived in a very, very small house, and probably 800 square feet for the 6 of us. And my mom always said that she played the timer. So when one of us would practice, and the next one would practice, and then we would play together. And we still do when we get together. So.
Well, you know, it's interesting, Marcia. Looking around, our viewers don't see this because of how we video these things, but we're in a fairly nice room in your rather beautiful home here in Palm Springs area. And over onto the right of the camera, off camera, is a grand piano. And I looked at that and I thought, somebody must be a serious player to have an instrument of that quality here.
Well, I used to be more serious than I am now. Now it's all music, just show tunes and 1940s and 50s music. And my husband Steve was quite a singer. He still sings. We regularly sit at the piano and have our evenings together. It's really nice.
Well, it was pleasant a few minutes ago. My son is traveling with me on this trip, and your husband is here, and we were all sitting out here on your patio, I guess you'd call it, and watching some of the desert birds and stuff coming along, the hummingbirds, the jay. I think there was a mockingbird in the area, and a gecko came along. I mean, it's interesting, and having a wonderful conversation over a little cup of coffee or whatever we were all drinking at the time. Has nothing to do with this interview, but it sort of sets the stage for it, and I'll let the viewers know that it's sort of how we do some of these things.
I always tell people that we lived in Wisconsin for 25 years until we got smart and realized there are places that you can live that there's snow all winter.
I've heard the same sentiments. In fact, yesterday in Los Angeles, I was there, and at least one of the parties had lived in Indiana for growing up, and it was not missing the shoveling
Right,
of the snow.
Sold all that equipment and the rakes and all that other stuff. And the
Yeah.
desert's really easy to take care of.
Well, I live in Olympia, Washington at the moment, which has a fairly benign climate, not quite as toasty warm as here in the summer and even the winter, but I have a snowblower. It's an electric one that we had in Maryland, and I'm probably the only person in Olympia, Washington that actually has a snowblower. And I've used it a few times in the 15 or so years I've lived there, but not very often.
Yeah.
We used to use it during nor'easters when we lived in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, getting back to you, since this is your story, not mine, Could I ask you if you have any hobbies, other special passions that occupy your time? I'd say outside of work, but as a retiree, any old time.
Yeah, yeah, we do. Steve and I are lucky enough to travel. My husband, Steve Smay, is a lawyer. We met. He was the state bar executive director in Wisconsin, and I was the state law librarian. And we've been married 32 years. We don't have children. We have nieces and nephews, and we always tell people we used all that college money to travel. And so that's
That's a trade-off one can make in life.
And so we've been traveling a lot, and we hike and we bike. We one of the reasons we're in the desert is because we just love to be hiking and in the mountains, and we bike almost every day, 15 to 20 miles.
Well, you know, this is the first time I've been to the desert Southwest. I've been to Las Vegas area, which is sort of there, but not like this. We're about, 100 miles east of Los Angeles or thereabouts.
Yeah.
And there's the mountains between, so they were getting rain this morning. We won't see that here.
No, it gets pretty warm here, and
it's really a nice. I mean, there are a whole string of towns here. I guess this is an oasis, or there's water, because things are green. And, the desert around it, obviously, is very different. But.
Well, Palm Springs was actually started really growing in the 30s and 40s, because the movie stars could be 2 hours away from Hollywood, and this was 2 hour.
I noticed a lot of the old stars' names are on the roads here.
Yes.
You know, they're named for them.
So this
Gene
is
Autry,
Frank
Fred
Sinatra,
Frank Sinatra.
Dinah Shore.
Yeah.
And Bob Hope. This was a big area, and it was.
So this was sort of their vacation home, or their extra home, the second home.
Exactly. Yeah. The Rat Pack used to hang out in Palm Springs. That was a big deal. And actually, I have a friend who lives in Jerry Lewis's old house.
Oh.
So it's kind of interesting.
It's a pretty extensive place, too. I suspect, just sort of looking around, there must be at least 100,000 people in this general area.
Well, in the whole area.
In all this sort of
there's a string of about 6 towns, Palm
they're
Springs.
sort of adjacent to each other.
Yeah. Palm Springs is about 40,000, and then it grows in the winter with all the snowbirds that come.
Yeah. I have neighbors who come down. I hope no crooks in the area where I live watch this video, because several of my neighbors are gone all winter. They come down here. They go to Arizona. I guess if we were on the East Coast, they'd be going to Florida and places. Yeah. And then they come back in the summer, and they said they missed the rain that way, and they want to miss the rain.
Exactly.
Yeah, but it's very pleasant. But you're a year-long resident, you and Steve, except when you're out traveling.
We're out traveling, and we've the summers get a little hot still. It's couldn't get up to 120, and then it doesn't go down.
That's why you have air conditioning.
We have air conditioning. You go out at 5:30 in the morning, and you're out till 8, and then you're inside. And the first year we were here, we binged watched television shows that we'd never seen before. So that was kind of takes up your afternoon. And then you go out at night. Yeah. But it's beautiful. We love the heat. So
Dick Spinelli lives in this area.
Not too far.
My son and I had dinner with him last night after we came in from Los Angeles.
Yeah, we don't see each other often enough because we're so close, and yet he's on the other side of town. It's a 25, 30-minute drive, and not a lot of traffic. But. Yeah.
He and his now late wife bought this place, it said, back in the 80s. And he had it as a second home when he was living near Denver, working with the Rothman Company. And he kept it even when he started working for Hine. And then after retirement, he decided, 2 houses is sort of expensive, he said. So he decided this would be the one he'd keep. So he's here.
I never think of Dick and the word retirement together.
He keeps his hand in the company, I understand. Although now the company this is 2018, we're in April, and the company has recently announced that the younger generation is finally moving up to begin managing the company for the real.
That'll be the third generation that
It will be.
I've known about. I knew Bill Sr.
That's right, he was still around.
When I started
his
working.
sudden death, his son, Bill, took over, he was in his early 20s.
Yeah.
That was, and he, now well, he's in our generation.
He's our
A
generation.
little bit older than teenager, not much. Well, should we return to what we're
Sure,
supposed to be talking about? But
absolutely.
this is fun. I'm enjoying it at least. You have 2 degrees. Could you tell us about those and where you got them?
Well, my master's in library science and is from the University of Missouri.
Mm-hmm.
And my parents were very important. It was very important to them to have us go to college, and we could go anywhere we wanted as long as it was the University of Missouri, because that's what they could afford.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's a reality. I mean, and it's a good school.
and it was a good school, and when I started there, they had not been accredited as a library school, but by the time I finished my college, just my bachelor's degree, they were accredited that year. And then, so I went on to my master's degree from there, and actually wound up teaching a few of the classes because I was already working in law libraries, and I taught the Federal Register and government documents and things, and that's where I was working. And so that degree is from the University of Missouri. And then years later, in the 90s, I was looking for something else to do, and I thought about going to, when I was in Wisconsin, I thought about getting a master's in business. But it was really hard to do when I was working full-time. And so the director of state courts suggested I try the court executive development program from the National Center for State Courts. And that's what I did. So I'm a fellow of the National Center of State Courts Institute for Court Management. I got that in 94, 93, 94.
So you sort of had an interesting academic background that preparing you for our world as law librarians, at least such as it was during the time you and I were active. And there were a lot of changes going on, but I think today, from what our colleagues are telling me, it's just a whole Wild West change again.
Exactly, yeah.
And I say that in a positive sense.
No,
actually.
it's very different. It's very different. I was the first person in, I think, the state capitol building in Wisconsin to have a fax machine.
We got an early one because I'm sort of into technology when I was at my library, and no one else seemed to have one, so we couldn't send stuff back and forth. But then that all developed.
Yeah, that was the first person in the court system to have a computer.
Yeah. I was the last one in the library to get one, but I had a executive secretary who did in those days, all my keyboard work.
Right.
And I didn't want to, learn this thing anyhow, let alone take away her job by doing any of it myself.
It's interesting. I mean, I was, now you'll date yourself, Marcia, but it's, I was around at the start of Lexis. And I was at the Missouri Supreme Court. And Missouri was one of the first 4 states on Lexis.
Okay.
It was started by, actually it turned out, he's a friend of my husband's, who is the executive director of the state bar in Ohio, Denny Ramey.
That's right, it started off as the Ohio Bar.
O-Bar,
Yeah,
and then it
O-Bar.
was Mo-Bar, and Tex-Lex, so Texas and New York, which was called Juris for some reason. So Denny's college or law school roommate was a judge at the Court of Appeals in Kansas City, who I knew. And he got me involved in Lexis, and I went to see the very first time it was shown. It was in Lake of the Ozarks at Tantera Resort, and they brought this machine that was like an old-fashioned television, that was this big with a screen that small.
Yeah, great big huge piece of furniture around it.
Yeah,
And a telephone probably that you had to physically hand dial,
coupler.
and there were dials in those
Yeah,
days.
yeah.
And then listen for it to the computer on the other end, and then put it into a coupler that connected it to yours.
Yeah, so I was around, and that was 72.
And you'd watch the
72,
screens, a page show up on the screen, and it would start at the top and slowly load.
Oh.
And we thought that was so great.
That green typing.
And the odd color, I didn't have colors, so
No.
in order to make it easier to read, they tried other colors. Green was one.
Green was one.
Amber was another, I think. I
Yeah,
saw.
yeah.
Well, interesting as it was. Well, we've sort of talked about your academic background, and we've
Okay.
sort of talked a little bit about some of your career, but could we talk more in depth about your career? Because you were,
Sure.
I remember when you were the state law librarian in Wisconsin and involved in all the citation stuff and so on. And then I know you ended up out here as the executive director at the Los Angeles County Law Library, but you've done a few other things, and could we sort of go through that?
Sure. I started, actually when I went to college, my mom took me right before I went to college, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. And I knew
You and everybody else.
I knew I fainted at the sight of blood, so I couldn't be a nurse.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't have a lot of patience, so I decided I shouldn't be a teacher. And anyway, so Mom took me for a series of classes and tests and stuff, and it turned out I was very organized and I really liked books, so I should be a librarian.
Mm-hmm.
So when I went to college, I worked in the university library.
Mm-hmm.
And I did bindery and the circulation desk, and then I worked for the business library. And I was there for about a year, and they wound up not having funds for the summer to pay you, and so I had taken political science courses that were civil rights and constitutional law, and I thought, well, I know about the law, I'll go across the street to the law school and start and see if they have an opening for a student. And they did, and I wound up working at the University of Missouri Law School. And I did that for about a year when I was taking more of my classes in judicial process. And I went down to the Missouri legislature once a week to work with the legislators. And I wound up meeting a gentleman whose name was Walt Nowotny. I'm not sure why I remember his name, but he said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I want to be a law librarian. And he said, you should go across the street to the Missouri Supreme Court and meet Babe Seibold. Her name was Mary Louise Seibold. Everybody called her Babe. And so I went over, met her, and she said to me, well, we don't have any openings now, but we have an assistant librarian position every once in a while comes open. I said, okay. So at the end of school, it was June, I believe, she called me and she said, my assistant has always been a law school student. And, at that time, the Missouri Supreme Court librarian, it was set by statute. So the librarian worked from 9 until 3, and the assistant worked from 3 until 9.
So that's how they stretched the hours.
The hours, and she called and said, my assistant is going to actually work for a law firm. I remembered you, and would you like to come and be the assistant librarian?
Sounds like an interesting job. Your boss was not there when you were on duty, so
It
you
was
could sort of get
perfect.
away with how you wanted to do things.
Exactly. And so I worked in Jefferson City. I called my parents and said, could you get me a car so I could drive from Columbia, Missouri to Jeff City? I have this opportunity. And they were kind enough to do that. And I worked there all summer. Then Babe said to me, I'm going to retire at the end of the year. The justices would really love it if you would apply for the job and they'd have somebody with a library degree. It's something they had never dreamed of. And so I applied, and
There you were.
and there I was, 23 years old, and I was the head of the
Candidate, they thought, super applicant, will hire her.
And I started January 1st, 1972 as the Missouri Supreme Court librarian. Without even finishing my degree, I was working on my master's thesis.
Yeah.
And I actually, one of the justices let me type on his mag card typewriter.
Oh, so you didn't have to
For
go
my-
on hand and do everything from scratch. Just
And that's-
make the changes like a word processor today would do.
Yeah. So I did my master's thesis on that machine.
And then you could crank out all the copies you might need without having to worry about onion skin and carbon paper copies, or maybe photocopy it by that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was just amazing. So I was very lucky, and I worked there from January of 72 until April of March, the end of March, 74, when I took the job at the Wisconsin State Law Library. which at that time was known as the Wisconsin State Library.
Okay.
It had been set up in 1875, I believe, or 1863, I think. And then there were 13 years where it was the state library. And it was a position that was appointed by the governor.
Mm-hmm.
In 1875, it became part of the Supreme Court, and the justices then hired the librarian. And from between
So when
1870,
you first went there, it was a general library, but
it
with,
was always a law library.
it was always a law library.
But they had never
The
changed
name
the name.
and the governance selection was the governor. Well,
Right.
Governors
early on.
love a lot of power, I understand.
And that's what happened. It was a general library, and then in 1875, that library split, and the Legislative Reference Bureau Library was started, and that had the general materials.
Oh, okay.
And the law materials stayed with the law,
Yeah.
well, the state library, but it was just the law books, and it was part of the Supreme Court. And I was only the 5th state law librarian from 1875 to 1974.
Sounded like a job, there's a lot of job hopping.
No,
You were there a while.
I was there, and I was there 26 years,
Yeah.
and so I stayed there from 74 until the end of 1999. And that was a terrific job. And I did wind up changing the name of the library officially to the Wisconsin State Law Library. But then in 1999, I had gotten my fellow as part of the National Center for State Courts, and I was really quite good friends with the man who was the president. And he asked me if I wanted to come and start their knowledge management program. And so I did that from 2000 for several years, and then tried to retire and wound up working for the University of Texas as the
Yeah, I know
deputy.
you were down there for a while. And
I was stabled for 26 years, and then the last
now
20
that's
years
a job
I don't know.
people tend to take in their salad days in the profession, and with our colleague Roy Mirsky,
Right.
who then teaches them what they need to know to be a law librarian. But
Precisely.
you went down, I guess, to straighten Roy out or something, maybe.
Well, Steve and I were actually driving from Williamsburg to Tucson, where we were going to build our dream retirement house. And we stopped in Austin and visited with Roy, and he said, "You didn't apply for my job as deputy director." And I said, "Roy, I know it's an entry, you always train people." He said, "No, I want somebody who really can do the administrative stuff." And I said, "Okay." So we wound up, once I agreed, then he had me go through all the steps of being, like a formal interview, and you had to give a lecture and all that stuff and write a paper. So I did all that, and he hired me as the deputy director.
Well,
And
he probably had to explain to HR and everybody else on campus that he was doing this all by the book. Instead of like in the old days, the draft board would just tell you, "You're it, come see us,
Precisely.
sign up."
So it was fun, and that was a good job. There was he really wanted me to help out with the business end of things, and I ran the facility and did the budget, and he wanted somebody who would be sort of a PR person to work with the associate deans and also the university library. He as the university law librarian and the university librarian had this major rivalry, and they were always trying to one-up each other. And
Knowing one of the two parties to it, Roy, I'm not surprised totally.
and the other gentleman wasn't any different. And so
They must have had an interesting go over the years.
They did, and
He was there a long time, Roy was.
and now I can't remember the librarian's name, but he was there for a long, long time. And but his deputies and my position all became good friends, and so our layer was able to really help the entire university library system kind of get back on track of speaking to each other and not being rivals. And I worked a lot with the associate deans at the law school, which was really really great fun. I like that.
You
So-
tried your hand in academics again?
Tried my hand in the academics, and then I went. Then I really thought I would retire. And then,
That must be a feeling of power when you decide to interview for another job. I'm thinking of retiring anyhow, so if I don't get it, well, I'll just retire.
I'll just retire. I'll just go ahead and retire. I wasn't really planning on working after
But you
Williamsburg.
did after that, and he did, you know.
Yeah, and then I went back to Wisconsin to do a whole program for the Chief Justice, and I was doing a lot of work with pro se litigants at that time through the ABA, and we wound up. The chief asked me if I would come back to Wisconsin to work on a project that changed all of the family court forms into plain language.
Okay.
Get rid of defendant and plaintiff and talk about husband and wife and, you know.
In other words, so non-lawyers could read them and know what they were reading.
And I worked with a group of judges for about 6-7 months, I think we worked, and rewrote the entire family code in plain English and created online forms that were then able to be filled in by each county's own particular rules, and it wound up being adopted by the Wisconsin Supreme Court as the system to be used. And then the circuit courts could decide whether or not they wanted to use it. Nearly all of the 72 counties selected that. And because it was all just so much easier, and then somebody could sit there. Once you put in your name and your spouse's name and the names of your children, it automatically filled all the forms. And it selected the forms you needed, whether you were...
Must have made it easier for the judicial system to deal with it, because they didn't get all this silly stuff because people didn't know what they were doing.
Exactly. There was a lot of check. One of the judges, he named it checky box time. So it was always checky boxes.
Good product.
It was great. Yeah, actually, he and I thought about how do we market this across the country, and we never did. But it seemed like a good idea.
Yeah.
So I did
you
that.
know, the same basic concepts with a
Precisely.
little local spin here and there would probably have worked a lot of other places.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I really thought I would retire, and that was in early '75. No, I'm sorry, 2005.
Yeah.
Early 2005. And then the LA Law Library, which was the Los Angeles County Law Library, called and said, "We know you're retired, but we'd like you to apply for this job." And I'm like, "No, I think I'll retire." He said, "No, you really should come and apply." And that had been a library that had been run for 25 years by a gentleman who was not active in AALL or in any of the other groups that weren't local. And I took one look at that library and I thought, this is Rip Van Winkle. This library is just asleep. And it could be so great. It is the largest public law library in the country, short of the Law Library of Congress.
Yeah.
And I thought, this thing just has so much potential. And so I took a 3-year contract with them and stayed 8 years. And then I finally did retire. So.
Well, you took on quite a library. I mean, especially back in the earlier years when Forrest Drummond and some of the
That's right.
luminaries were running it. He was the head of the library then for a long time, since I guess the end of World War II until
he retired.
Must have retired, what, in the 70s or?
Right, and he was actually going to retire, and then he changed his mind or something and came back, and he was there, golly, 30 years, I don't know.
Well, in those days, he was active in the association, as were a
I
number
met
of his
him.
people. Yeah.
I met him.
Yeah.
I remember meeting
I
him.
remember meeting him years ago too. And Bill Stern, who was his foreign and international librarian,
Exactly.
who was president of AALL back in my early days in the association.
Well, Bill built that, really the foreign international
Yeah.
collection, which was, honestly, I don't know how well it's doing right now, but it is one of the premier foreign law collections.
Well, I imagine with budget realities of the current era, that are having more trouble struggling to maintain the breadth of such a collection, because it
Correct.
was
Yeah.
pretty much. Now, while you were there, was the decision then made, or had that been made, to adopt the Library of Congress cataloging? Because LA County, I mean,
Chris started.
Library of Congress sort of didn't quite get around to doing the law schedules, the case
Precisely.
schedules, for a long, long time. And,
Yeah.
you know, the people running the LA County decided we needed to not wait.
And
I'm
they-
putting it my, whatever.
No, but that's exactly right. And they
Yeah, and
started
they
their
came
own
up with a
system.
scheme that was very good, and you know, a number of us were thinking of using it, or were beginning to use it, and then LC finally made their
Right.
official version.
And no, that was my decision. That was a major struggle with
You come into a really
the collection
established
management
place, and everybody's sort of sold on how they're doing it.
Yeah, it was resisted
The
for
new
several
head
years.
executive director comes in with all these wishy-washy thoughts, like, why can't we do it our way?
That was something I put off like 2 or 3 years before I knew there was no going there. But it was time to get on it. And if you wanted that collection to be useful
Yeah.
to people around the world, you know, it had to be cataloged in the correct way. But it took
Yeah,
5
it had
years.
to plug into the systems that were being used by multiple libraries,
Sure.
like OCLC and some of the others. And,
But it meant reclassifying. I mean,
yeah, you had
I
to
found it.
speak in the same library language as everybody
Well,
else.
you know, I even found it really difficult to go to the shelves because the books weren't where I expected them to be, you know? So somebody outside, and I said, I think my most persuasive argument was, you know, the person who was the head of that collection management program, I said, you're going to retire someday and we'll never be able to hire law librarians to catalog this library because nobody will know this system. We have to get on the main track. And that was the persuasive argument,
Yeah.
is that we just had librarians who had been there for a while and you knew that they would retire. And how are you going to hire young people? They
I
only
think
learn Library of Congress.
Basically learned a whole different system.
Yeah.
Well, not a whole, but a different system.
It was very different.
Was it?
Yeah, it didn't, you know what, I never really quite figured it out. But it didn't classify things in the same manner as LC.
Okay.
Subject matters were divided up oddly, I thought, but that was just fine.
Well, it's all, you know, there's got to be a scheme, and, you know, there are different versions of how that can be. And
Yeah.
they had theirs, and LC came up with a different, yeah.
But it was a major project,
Yeah.
because that meant taking every book off the shelf, labeling it, and then putting it back on the shelf and figuring out.
So you
this-
retroactively,
Every single book in that, one of the million volumes is now
Wow.
cataloged and has a label on it, and,
So
yeah.
really quite an undertaking. I mean, you
Was-
obviously had to think that through yourself carefully.
Right. Because we had to figure out the space, and
Yeah.
where were you gonna create the hole?
And the resources to do all this.
We actually had 35 miles of shelving in that library.
Wow.
And I know because I counted them all on 7 floors. And only one of the floors of the library was open to the public. The rest of it was all closed shelving.
Yeah. That was, you know, today we think of the library and the people sitting around and surrounded here and there by book stacks and computer terminals, and it's hard to realize that that's a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, the libraries of the old days, you had a reading room with certain basic stuff, and then everything else you had down in the, or wherever the stacks were.
7
And even before that, instead of self-service, they'd have pages or attendants go down and get the book, hopefully, if they could find it.
Well, that's true, and you had people, and that was one of the things, I don't know if you know any of the stories about the LA Law Library, but one of the stories was there was always a ghost in the library, in the stack area, and there were phones on every floor, because the main reading room, like you said, was on the main floor. It was
Yeah.
actually on the 3rd floor when you walked in. And then the shelving was on 7 floors. And there were phones. And people would tell you that the phones would ring on these different floors, but they were disconnected.
Oh, they
And
weren't using them anymore.
No, there was no phone system, but they would ring. And we actually had a young woman we hired as a shelver, and she quit. She was.
I think I'd check into the fire insurance if this is going on.
She was like just freaked out. This phone was ringing, and there was, it's not even connected. So anyway, there were a lot of stories like that.
I started out in a library built in the 30s, a law library, and we had closed shelves, and we had a phone system and intercom system, so the people at the circulation desk, which was on the 3rd floor, all the heavy stuff being down below, like the books, and you could call down, and the attendant down there would then find the book, put it in a book lift, and send it up.
Yeah,
I mean, that had sort of
exactly
stopped
how it
when I
worked.
came, but that's what's the system.
No, that was the way the LA Law
Yeah,
Library
and
was
I
set
think
up.
a lot of them worked that way, at least at one point.
Sure.
Yeah, so you still had semblance of the old system, and the ghost was ringing the phones to scare these
Those
people
was
out.
ringing the phones. I don't know. I never heard it ring, but I was told.
Maybe the ghost was protecting the books. If anyone looked like they might swipe one, the phone would ring and tell them they weren't supposed to.
Probably.
Oh, so it sounds like you had some interesting impact on the Law Library of Congress with that decision alone. Is a big
The
thing.
LA Law Library?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I said Law Library.
Yeah.
I misspoke. Yeah, LA.
Yeah, it was a really exciting 8 years. We changed everything about that library. We renovated it inside, and we renovated the exterior too, and put on a new roof, and re-waterproofed the building. So we had to dig up the several floors down and recode everything. But totally renovated.
When did you pick up your degree in architecture and in engineering and some of the other things you needed to do that?
Well,
you didn't mention that earlier.
Yeah, no, actually, years and years ago, I want to say in the early 80s, maybe, I took a course from Aaron and Elaine Cohn on space design.
I went to one of their sessions before we built some building in the old days.
And
they were very good.
They were
very
wonderful.
practical.
And I worked with them over several years on some projects, and I took a series of classes from them, and Aaron was always on the other end of the phone when I needed him. And it turned out that even in Wisconsin, when I started there was only circuit courts and the Supreme Court. There was no Court of Appeals. So the Court of Appeals started in '78. So I had to go and build libraries for the 4 Court of Appeal districts. And so that's really how I learned how to design space. And over the years, I really did a lot of that because we redesigned a number of libraries. The Milwaukee County Law Library became part of our state law library, the state law library system, the Dane County, which is Madison. And then all the circuit courts that I went into, I helped, renovate or redesign or whatever. So I did a lot of that work, and ultimately in '99.
Like a lot of us in library science, you maybe don't take that in school, although I think one of our colleagues, the late Peyton Neal, they have. But you end up working with buildings and that kind of thing all the time in your career.
Yeah. I mean, I think I started out as a terrific reference librarian. And then one day somebody asked me a question, and I'm like, I can do the budget, I can do personnel, and I can do buildings, but I can't do reference anymore. And that's really what happens.
That's the trouble when you get into administration. You become more, I used to call it back office part of the operation. Precisely. Without being in the catalog or something. And it is a change, and you miss some of that, I think.
I did.
But somebody's got to do it, so it's you.
It was. I remember that sinking feeling that, oh my gosh, I can't do reference anymore. And I really liked
with
it.
all the changes and so on, that's understandable.
Yeah.
But you're right, the sinking feeling.
It is. But I was very lucky just to do a lot of design. And actually, Steve wound up rebuilding the state bar building, then building a new state bar building. So we were both kind of into that, and we built several houses. And We, you know,
A
we're
husband
very,
and wife team on design, so you can do, you take over for the Cohens now and teach everybody how to do this.
right. So we're very good at space and
Yeah.
design and, you know, thinking how to use the space in a better way and stuff. But I think a lot of things that Aaron and Elaine, you know, talked about early on really stuck.
Well, I remember coming back from one of their, series of sessions, and we were getting ready to renovate a building on our campus to be the new law library and get us out of the basement of the law school. And I was talking about stuff that the designers and the physical plant people hadn't gotten to there yet. I said, why don't we talk about high intensity discharge lighting? And they looked at me, and they were still into the old fluorescent tubes, and
Yeah,
this was a ways back.
right.
And they got their tubes. I didn't get that fancy new lighting, but
Well, I remember the one thing that Aaron said to me is no matter how big the table is, two people will sit there. One at this corner and one at that corner. And it's only when all the other tables are filled that they'll fill in. So don't put a table with 12 chairs around it. Put a table with 4. And you'll get more people using the library.
Yeah.
And he was right.
And they'll have space for all their stuff. And get tables that are a decent size.
Decent size, and then eventually that they had electrical outlets.
Yeah. And for a while, data ports.
Data
and then
ports.
when good Wi-Fi came in, that sort of eliminated the data ports or the need for them. But times do change. Yeah, so once they come up with a better battery than they have today, you still want plugged someplace
Yes.
nearby.
Yeah, USB ports.
Yeah. Well, you have done a variety of interesting things, as you've been telling us. But one thing we haven't talked about that I remember you for is your work on coming up with how we handle the digital versions of cases. How do we cite to them? How do we find the material? In the old days, we had mostly West Publishing Company, a commercial company, had their system that worked just fine in the days when everything was in their books.
Correct.
Everyone had. But times were changing, and you were part of that as we needed. And West, since they owned this system and wanted to continue to own the market,
Yes.
were less than fully cooperative, to put it nicely, but it's business,
Yeah.
not personal, as they say in the old Godfather movie.
Yeah.
But you got involved very much in working with courts in Wisconsin, you were there at the time, and beyond Wisconsin, and coming up with some of the newer systems. You want to talk us a little bit about that part of your career and experience?
That probably, stems from the whole idea that I was working with Lexis early on and developing more knowledge about technology, which has no meaning today in today's world. But at the time, the State Bar started a task force on technology resources. There was a gentleman there who asked if, I would work with them. And that was because, actually this is kind of how I met Steve, was that the state law library, every year I went to the legislature to try to get money for a Lexis system at the state law library in Wisconsin, because they had it in Missouri because we were one of the states.
Yeah.
And they said, well, we don't know that people will really pay for the service. So the State Bar Association became the collection agency. The state law library did the research, and then we would send out the invoice, but the bar would actually collect the money and then pay. And the legislature was fine with that. So because I was involved in that online legal research, and I wrote a column for the State Bar every month on online legal research, I met some of the lawyers who were also interested in technology. And the more we talked, the more we thought, this is silly. Why are we citing to a volume, a physical volume and a page when it's online and nobody knows there's no pages?
Yeah.
I mean, long before PDF, you could actually put a page on. That was in nobody's thought.
That's right, it was just The text was
Just
the
the
same,
text.
but it wasn't set up as pages and all
Right.
that.
So we created a system that we then took to the State Bar of Wisconsin, and the Board of Governors approved it. And then from there, we took it to the American Bar Association and I took it to AALL. And the same thing was being thought of in about, 3 or 4 other places. Lynn Foster from Arkansas and Carol Billings in New Orleans. And so the three of us were kind of the mothers of vendor neutral citation,
Yeah.
which is what we called it at the time.
Yeah.
And AALL was very supportive.
Yeah.
And
Well, Carol was president during that era. She was, I think, my immediate predecessor.
Yeah.
And that was one of the really big issues that she dealt with, and
Right.
you were very much part of that
Yeah.
in
And
a
I was-
positive way.
yeah, and it was a wonderful, time to be in the profession. We were a lot of high energy, a lot of great thoughts.
Yeah.
And the association was terrific about allowing my committee to work together for like long weekends. We would meet on a Friday afternoon and then we'd work till Sunday. And we sat in a meeting room talking about, should you put a comma here or a period there or
Yeah.
what? It
That
was
kind of
Paul
minutia
George-
is all part of that reality of
Paul
how you
George
do
and
this.
Bruce Kennedy and Ken McKeever. And I mean, it was really high energy and intellectual thought about how would people find this information online.
Yeah.
And we actually, AALL adopted it, ABA actually adopted it, about 12 states adopted the vendor neutral system. And like I said, it was long before anybody thought about doing a PDF.
Yeah.
But then West obviously didn't like what was going on and filed a lawsuit. And the suit was held, the case was held in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the briefs that were filed were fascinating, and I think West Publishing came, Bill, what was his name? Who was the head of West Publishing? I can't even remember, I can picture him.
Opperman was.
Opperman,
Yeah,
Dwight Opperman. Dwight and
Dwight's
Vince.
son was involved.
Vince Opperman.
Vince, and he
but-
was a former litigator.
Yes.
And still sort of operated that
And-
way.
and he
I
did.
remember it was harder to deal with than Dad.
Yeah, Dwight was a little bit more more the older statesman, I think.
Yeah, whereas the son
very
was more direct.
And-
Both good guys.
Yeah, and it was fascinating. I mean, it was really an amazing time to be in the profession. And the court hearing was, we had people from all over the United States
Yeah.
and people from foreign countries. And,
Probably thinking of Bill Lindbergh, because you said Bill something.
yeah, Bill Lindbergh.
He
yeah,
was the outreach guy.
Outreach guy.
Yeah, he was great.
I forgot about it. And
Yeah.
So one of the really interesting things about the vendor neutral, that kind of a little known fact, is that the place that adopted, the publishing company that adopted vendor neutral first was the International Tribunal.
Oh,
Because they published in 4 or 5 languages.
okay.
And so instead of having a page in French and a page in German and a page in
Yeah.
Spanish or whatever, and they had a lot of blank spaces. Once they started citing by the vendor neutral, they could just run.
Go right
the-
to the paragraph or
Yeah,
whatever the system
and it didn't
was.
matter
Yeah.
whether your paragraph was a footnote or a headnote or anything, as
Or
long
on
as
one old
or the
page
text.
or another if you did it in book form.
right. So that was that was. I don't have any idea if they still do that, but it was something that was, a relatively kind of a sideline that we were very proud of at the time, because they saw the value in it right away. But
Well,
anyway,
it certainly solved some problems that, needed to be solved now that things were coming out in
Sure.
other than book format and other than a particular company, West's books for the most part too.
well, and I remember one of the big arguments in favor of doing this was, have you ever read the Bible? It's it's just vendor neutral, because it doesn't matter what form it's in,
Yeah.
each verse is identified.
Yeah, the way they have it structured.
Yeah.
And as language changes over the years, and new translations from one language to another, from the originals to, you know, it changes a little bit here and there, although some people might not like to recognize that. But it has to be kept up with what people understand.
Precisely, yeah. But it was, it was a really heady time to be in the profession.
Yeah.
And we, as law librarians, I think we were able to be recognized by the legal community in a very different way, not just as kind of the researchers, but as people who really could look at technology. And I think it had advanced our standing with the American Bar Association and with a lot of the court systems. And
It showed that we had an expertise and we were players.
Correct.
At the table.
Yes.
For the first time in some ways that we hadn't perhaps been as a profession, when we were more isolated from some of the other parts.
Yeah. So it was good. It was all a lot of fun.
Yeah. Well, you were involved in this heady stuff and so on. But you've also done other things, professional nature. Is there anything that you particularly comes to mind that you'd like to talk about or mention, or is that asking for maybe too much?
I think I should mention that I was there at the beginning of the state court and county.
Yes, you were.
And
you have their Bethany J. Okel Award for all the stuff you did with them. Now they're known now as the state government
law libraries.
Yeah.
But I was there in '73.
Mm-hmm.
It was a meeting in Seattle, and Raymond Taylor and Maggie Sutliff. Raymond was North Carolina, and Maggie was Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And I were talking after.
Yeah, Raymond Taylor, I remember.
Raymond Taylor. He had about
He spoke like a senator.
Yes, he did.
Yeah,
and he had about 7 syllables to his name. Raymond Taylor.
Yeah, he became the superintendent of documents.
Yes, he did.
And his signature is on my library became a document depository. His signature is on our certificate.
Oh, neat.
And I thought, it's nice to have somebody I sort of knew.
Yeah, that was great. So what happened was there was a program at AALL that was directed at court libraries in Seattle. And after that program, Raymond and Maggie and I were talking and said, we really need to have, a lot of the programs at AALL are directed to academics, and we really need to have our own kind of thing. And so we put out the word that we were going to meet at lunch in a hotel room. We scrambled and got a hotel room. And I'll bet there were 25 or 30 people that showed up. And I just gave my papers to the University of Illinois, the AALL archives, but I had that first handwritten membership list from 1973. And we went back home and decided we would charge $6 to be a member, so we could send.
Oh, you lost me some in those days, but I bet you paid.
Yeah, but we wanted to be able to mail mimeographed newsletters out. And
mimeographed? What's that?
and then we got AALL to put on a program in 1974. And I did the first program. It was LEAA money, Law Enforcement Assistance Act. It was LEAA money for law libraries, and I had gotten some money at Missouri, and I was able to have the director of the program came and spoke, and it was a really good program. But it was the first time on a Sunday morning that AALL approved having a specialized group.
Well, you had a lot of competition at that meeting. You may or may not even remember this happened, but the city of Seattle blew up a ship or something out on the bay. You remember the fire out on
Yes.
We were all sort of mesmerized. What's that?
What's that? Yeah.
Hadn't been planned, actually, like I just suggested.
But that was, so that was 73. 74 was our first meeting, and then we petitioned AALL to be a special a committee, a separate committee, and they said we don't have a structure for having like type libraries be a committee.
Okay.
And Marion Bonner was the president,
All right.
I think, and they went back, and a year later they came up with special interest sections, and that's how special interest
That was
sections
the
got
beginning,
started.
yeah.
And
And now the association is actually, a lot of their work is done at the
By
special interest
section,
section
yeah,
level.
So we had started it, and we called it the State and Court Law Libraries. So it was SCLL, and we changed it when we applied for special interest section at AALL. We became the State, Court, and County Law Libraries, and that's how SCCLL got started. And you know, and that was a wonderful group to be part of, going to conferences, as you remember. My first conference was '72. And there were 300 law librarians there.
It was nice in those days. I mean, it was nice in a different sense later on, but the smaller group, you really got to know each other.
Got to know everybody.
And there was more social after the business of the day. We had the evenings, and the publishers had hospitality centers and suites. And
Oh yeah.
go around.
You didn't have to buy a meal. I mean,
network
everybody.
and eat and drink and talk to
whatever.
people. It was wonderful
Yeah.
in its own way.
My first meeting was 1972 in Chicago, and I had a ribbon that said first timer.
I remember those, yeah.
Okay, and I was coming down an elevator, and Connie Bolden had a ribbon that said executive board.
Oh,
and he looked at me.
Somebody in the establishment big time.
Yeah, he looked at me and he said, "We've never had anybody from Missouri Supreme Court." And he sat and talked to me for about 45 minutes, and I was so thrilled. It was just, it was
Connie was a
eye-opening.
court law librarian at Olympia, Washington.
He was
at
the
state
head of the
law library.
And I forgot to mention that. And he eventually became the president of AALL. And but after my first meeting, I went back to the Missouri court, and the chief judge said to me, "Well, what'd you learn?" And I said, "I don't know, but I've got this long list of phone numbers." And he said, "You learned the right thing."
Exactly.
And
you have a need, you pick up the phone, even in those days
Even
when it
those
cost
days,
real money
yeah.
to call, and,
Exactly.
and you get your information or source.
And that was kind of like my start in the AALL. So that was great. I don't know how I got off on that, but it was that whole era of the 70s and the 80s. Well, AALL was really growing.
Yeah.
And not
And
only
there were growing pains, and the SIS system helped keep
to
it
do
from fracturing, I think.
precisely. And you know, when you think about it, private firms, I mean Jack Ellenberger and people like that, there were people who were with private firms, but it wasn't a really big deal at that point.
And that's where the growth in the next era for our profession really came to us from the private firm sector.
Yeah, and Jim Sheelar had just gone from he was in Ohio, he was in Cleveland, and he went to Arnold and Porter in DC. And Jim asked me if I would be his second for Connell, was a kind of a new thing. And I said yes, and then the next year I took over Connell, and it was 76, I think, in Boston. And it was the first time Connell had a social. We went to the Gardner Museum. It was a beautiful house, old house museum. And it was the first, so it set the stage for how Connell would be run. You would have meetings and try to get to know people and know about the association, and then you would have a social event.
I mean, a few years earlier, even up in that era, you had somebody take you around and introduce you. Al Coco was my new boss when I went to that first meeting, or I hadn't actually even started, but Al came and he knew I was going to be one of his assistants, and we got to meet this one and that one. And so I'd meet everybody who was anybody, and a lot of other people who became anybody's, but weren't there yet. And
did you go to the summer program, the institute?
No, I never went to one of those.
Okay,
that was another way people networked in the early days.
We did.
The rotating institutes.
Rotating institutes, and I did all 4 of them, and Lolly Gassaway and Sally Wyant and Alan Hollick,
Yeah.
Al
they were
Brecht,
involved, yeah.
our generation, you know.
Yeah. Well, I had come up in a system where I had worked as a student of one sort or another for like 11 years, starting as a high school kid, underage, which is another story. They didn't realize I was only 15.
Ooh.
Worked for a week and they
I did
the end
that
of the
too.
summer, and then I think when it came time to give me a paycheck, I don't know, the library director or the dean may have had to come up with that money on their own, I'm not sure. But I got paid and I didn't care, I didn't know. It was later I found out there was problems. But then I started the next year as I was old enough, and so, but I had a lot of background that many of the people coming into the field wouldn't have, so the institutes were not really something I felt like was needed.
Well, those were great bonding.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it was the week before the conference, and we put on plays and skits about the professors and stuff. And it was really, it was
A few years before that, there was a meeting in the early 60s in Mackinac Island where they were all trapped on the island, and the stories about that, I actually read about it
Julius
years
Mark.
later. He was president
Yeah.
at New York University, Julius J. Mark, and it's interesting to read in the Law Library Journal, but it's very different than even, I was a few years later, in 68 when I first went, and they were still talking about that meeting, but they never did anything quite like it. And they never held it again at a place where you were sort of locked by the ferry system on the island.
I know. Oh, it's a beautiful island.
Yeah.
But that was a lot of fun. So those things were good. I think the other thing is, I was lucky enough to serve on a number of committees. There was the committee, we now have the government representative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well the start of that was a committee, I don't even know if I can remember the name of it, Committee on Organization, I can't remember the name of it. Bob Oakley and I were on that committee, and there were several other people. Yeah. And we actually presented a program after the committee had given their information to the association. Mm-hmm. And I ran the program on what it would be lobbying, if AALL did lobbying, what would it look like? And so then the association started having a government representative. So there were a lot.
And Bob Oakley became that.
Oh, yeah.
And then they hired Mary Alice Beisch, and I think there was somebody before that who sort of began doing most of the work, because Bob had some sort of a day job as head of the library in Georgetown.
Just a small job. But I mean, you know, so I was involved in a lot of things that were interesting, and I loved a lot of the meetings and the government, not the government work, but the behind the scenes work of the organization. I actually once applied to be the executive director.
Oh, okay.
AALL.
Maybe
I think I came in second.
Maybe you're just as happy you were second. That's been a tough job all along. Although
I guess I always thought I would.
But now it's coming open again.
Kate's leaving.
Kate's retired, or I don't know if she's leaving or retiring.
She's retiring probably.
Yeah, probably.
But no, I'm not going. I'm retired.
Well, you said that about LA County, and then look what happened.
I know.
And look what you did. Yeah.
So,
but let me also mention, I had mentioned you were given an official recognition in the Oakley or Oakle Award, but you also have a scholarship named in your honor. It's given out at AALL by the government library.
Right.
I'm thinking of the name now. I'm so used to the old one.
Law library group. Yeah. That was really interesting, because that was in 1994. Mm-hmm. So right during the heat of the vendor neutral stuff, and I won a West Excellence in Law Librarianship award. And
maybe they were trying to bribe you, or something.
I don't know, but Vince, it was an evening thing, and he handed me this huge, I still have it, it weighs about 12 and 20 pounds or something, a piece of crystal that had my name on it and everything. And then it came with a $10,000 scholarship and award. And as the state law librarian, I couldn't take the award. And so I put it in a community fund. And it grew for about, I don't know, almost doubled in the amount of money. And when I finally figured out what I wanted to do was with it, I gave it to AALL to allow other law librarians originally to go through the court executive development program that I had gone through with the National Center for State Courts. Because all of the classes that I went to there, you know, people would say, well, our law librarian doesn't do this. We've never met a law librarian like you. We never, you know. And I thought, this is where law librarians who work in court systems can become more relevant to the whole court system, to understand it, not just be an isolated island at the court. And, you know, I really tried to push that. Now I think it's used for people who want to go to different meetings and stuff, which is fine. But at the time I remember thinking this was probably the best thing I'd ever done in my life, was going to this National Center for State Courts program.
Yeah. Now I'm about to pose, which is usually my last real question, but before I do it, and that's basically asking you if there's anything we haven't talked about that, as we near the end. But I want to bring up one thing that we did sort of slide by, and I want to have you focus on, if you don't mind, and that is mentors in the field. You mentioned off camera a couple before we started, and you mentioned Connie Bolden, who I think was one of those names, but could you talk about mentors, people you would see in that role affecting your career, especially as you were getting launched?
Yeah, well, the first person who comes to mind was a woman whose name was Jean Ashman.
Oh, I remember
She was at
Jean.
Washington University in St. Louis, and I wrote my master's thesis on the Court of Appeals libraries in Missouri. And they were one in Springfield, one in Kansas City, one in St. Louis. Three very separate, unique libraries, had no knowledge or information about the other libraries, let alone about the Supreme Court Library. And in the process of doing that, I wound up meeting Jean and talked with her about how do we get these people together to know what else they can, you know, how they can share their materials and stuff. And she and I got law librarians from Missouri and from, I think from SIU came, and from some of the, like Monsanto or the companies in St. Louis. We had a luncheon. And from there started the Mid-America Law Library Association. So
that's another thing. I mean, there were a few chapters when I started and you started.
Everybody went to Southwest.
There were new ones coming in. The needs were different.
Yeah. So we started Mid-America, and so Jean was really instrumental in teaching me a lot about how to put together a library, what to do. I mean, I came out of library school and never really worked for any, I mean, as a student, but here I was running a library, you know, and Babe Seibold, who was the librarian whose place I took, she had the 3x5 index cards, and so when you got volume 562 of the Fed Sup, she would erase that and write 563, you know, and then erase.
Yeah, great records.
So the record had holes all over it, you know, where she had erased for years. So Jean helped me set up a whole new system with mag cards. They were big cards where you checked in stuff. Taught me about reference work that I, you know, to a different extent, and also taught me a lot about the politics of libraries. She was great. And Connie Bolden was another. I mentioned that I had met him at my first conference, and he was such a quiet, you know,
sort of a gentle soul.
Gentle soul, yeah.
And in the not necessarily the pejorative sense of that either.
No, but he knew his stuff, and he knew about court libraries and how to interact with judges. And, you know, and I was a kid. I was 23 years old, and, you know, I remember asking one of my college professors, I'm going to work for the Supreme Court, what do I do? I'm just scared to death. And he said, "Oh, just picture them up there in long red flannel underwear." I was like, "Okay."
They were just folks like the rest of us.
And then Connie helped kind of reinforce that you can actually talk to judges and lawyers, and this is how you do it. And so he was very instrumental, and I still have. When he was president, that was the year that I ran the hotel conference in 1980 in St. Louis, and I ran the hotel part. And Connie gave me a photograph of a cliff. And it's kind of pale blues and yellows of a cliff off of the Washington State. I can't remember the name of it, and I have it framed, and it's a very special piece to me.
Probably some body of water down
Body
the
of
bottom.
water.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah,
was water.
Now, do you have a recollection of who Connie's predecessor at the State Law Library in Olympia was?
No.
Another one of your contacts, Roy Mirsky.
No.
He was the state law librarian in one of his early part of his career. He'd been at Yale as the associate. Well, I don't know what the title was in those days, but he was the number 2 administrator in the law library at Yale. And he went out to be the state law librarian and was in Olympia, Washington for a few years. Then he went to the University, I think, of Colorado before he went to Texas, which is where most of his career was spent.
And Roy told me, I don't know if you know, Roy got his law degree at Wisconsin.
Yes.
Okay, so he was a member of the bar, and he wound up on the board of governors at the bar, which Steve ran. And Roy told me that the job he always wanted was to be the state law librarian in Wisconsin. And he was.
And you stole
and
his job.
and I had
Somehow
no idea.
I think he did just fine.
I think he did just fine without me.
Yeah.
But it was, but our interactions were really interesting because of that, the history. So, I mean, I was very lucky. I had good friends. We had the older generation, the Marion Gallaghers, the people who were named and, had the tradition of law librarianship, but were really forward-looking people. Yeah. And then to watch all of our contemporaries grow and, all of us get old. In the association.
That's the sad part. But the alternative is scary. That's all I'm told.
True. That's what they say.
Yeah.
But we've been, it's been a great life to have this.
Well, as I alluded a few minutes ago, I customarily note that we're coming kind of to the end of today's conversation. But before we do, is there anything we've not talked about that you would like to mention? And don't feel this is a test, you gotta come up with something. A lot of people don't.
Yeah.
Some do.
No, I think, this will make me cry, but when I finished at Wisconsin after 26 years, I remember saying, see, I get teary, but saying that, a lot of young people will switch jobs a lot more.
Yeah. The millennial
our
group supposedly does that.
6, 7 years,
the way it is.
They're done. And to stay someplace 26 years was really to watch the growth and be able to be empowered to move that change.
Make it really be your place.
Yeah, it was really special, and the State Law Library still has, a special place for me. Yeah. And the woman who's the State Law Librarian now was a youngster I hired to shelve books at age 18. And when I left there, she was 36.
Wow.
And so we worked together for 18 years. And half of her life had been in that law library, and half of my life had been there because I left, I was 50. And so I went there when I was 23, 24. No, 25.
Sound like a place with a lot of job hopping.
Yeah,
and
so I was very lucky to be in one place that was able to grow and serve the court, but serve the legislature, serve the governor's office, serve all the state executive agencies. It was really a very good time, apolitical because you served everybody, and I really liked that. And the court gave me tremendous freedom to grow that library and expand its services. including, they gave me opportunities after I got my fellowship from the National Center to do consulting work.
Mm-hmm.
And I did consulting work with the Colorado Supreme Court, Hawaii Supreme Court. I got to go to Hong Kong and work with the China court when they were combining Hong Kong into China, one China. And so I did a whole report on that. In the court, the Wisconsin Supreme Court was very supportive, and people you remember, and the Chief Justice Shirley Abrahamson was a great mentor of mine and really supportive. So.
Well, that sounds like you had a fascinating career. Well, I already knew that before. I mean, when we select people whom I'm supposed to talk on camera for this project, we want interesting people who've done sometimes different things than some of the rest of us.
Yeah.
Sometimes a lot of the same. I mean, this is both.
Yeah.
But I want to sort of on that note, thank you, Marcia Koslov, for agreeing to be part of our oral history of law librarianship for the Spinelli's Law Library Reference Shelf section of Hein Online. And in thanking you, I'm thanking you not just on my own behalf, I had the fun of coming in here and chatting with you, but also Michelle Wu, Frank Kodak, and of course Dick Spinelli, who's sort of a neighbor type of yours out here in the sunny part of California. Well, it's all pretty sunny, but in the desert. And so I'm thanking you on their behalfs as well, and thank you for being part of our history today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure, and I wish everybody well in their retirement careers and in all the young people coming on board who might see this.
Well, I highly recommend retirement. Being retired myself, as you are, and you get to the point that if you can stay active at least for a while, hopefully we all can. You sort of wonder how it is I had time to work.
Well, sometimes I do. I do run the homeowners association here, so I haven't done that.
Well, there's always somebody they need to say yes
somebody,
to that.
Yeah, some fool who will do it. But
I've been involved as treasurer of mine for the last 6 years. I just finally gave it up to another neighbor back in January when our fiscal year changed.
Well, we do a lot of traveling, and we do a lot of exercise.
Yeah, off camera, we were talking about with your husband Steve and you, and about the road trips, which I do too. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Retirement has some advantages. Doesn't pay as well though.
Yeah, not quite as good, but it's.
And you don't have as many tax deductions, I've discovered too.
That's true, and fewer coming. But it's been, it's really been hard to believe that 40 plus years have gone by since you started. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you for allowing me to be thankful for that. Thank you.